Today I'm going to paint this empty jar. It's a jar that I use in my gouache kit for cleaning my brushes. I like this jar because it's got some areas of sediment up at the top where the glass is opaque because of the paint that's stuck to it, and down at the bottom where the water typically is, it's relatively clear and transparent and you can see the background right through it. When I paint glass, I try to make a clear distinction between these two properties. Can I see through it, or am I looking at the surface of it? I'm using a palette of cobalt blue, cad yellow light, cad red light, and some titanium white. I start by mixing up some orange and then I dull it down with a little bit of cobalt blue. I add some mineral spirits and do a quick block in of my subject. I start with a vertical mark to help me place my subject. I then rough in the silhouette and add a few details on the surface. I have a very slight arc at the bottom, and the edges of the lid are practically flat since they're about at my eye level. I want a warm neutral for my background color, so I mix up some orange again and then dull it down with the cobalt blue. I then mix up a couple of different values of this. For that cool neutral tone at the top of the jar where the sediment is, I start by mixing up some green with my cobalt blue and my cad lemon yellow. I add a little bit of cadmium red to that to dull it down, and then I mix up a couple of different values of that. Below that point on the jar, the sediment takes on a little more reddish cast. So I make an offshoot from this color string and add a little bit more cad red to it. The next color family I need are the gold tones for the lid of the jar. I use my blue and red and mix up a very dark violet. I then add a little bit of that to some yellow to create a variety of neutral yellow tones to use for the golds in that cap. Now that I have my major color groups mixed, I start putting them where they go. I start with the cool neutral tones at the top of the jar. I then establish the darks at the bottom of the jar. I add a little bit of cast shadow and I immediately start getting some background established. Remember, the background colors are a major part of what makes up the jar since we can see right through it. So I want to get those colors established as quickly as I can so I can start making some clear judgments on what the relationships between the other parts of the jar are and the background. Once I have some background put in, I can start adding those slightly reddish tones that occur in the sediment moving down the jar. The reddish tone that I pre-mixed isn't quite vibrant enough, so I need to add a little bit more cad red to that. This is why it's important to get some background color established early. It's hard for me to see what the colors are actually going to do until I have them in context. Now that I have the jar pretty much blocked in, I move on to the dark parts on the cap of the jar. This reflective gold can be a little bit tricky, and I know if I get too much yellow in there it's not going to look right, so I'm trying to use the yellow relatively sparingly. Once I get the lights and darks of the lid established, I throw some background color around it. I'm using a slightly darker version of my background color to go across the top of the lid. I'm doing that because I want that light part of the lid to show up really well against the background. Now that I've got my subject completely blocked in, I can start adding some more background and making some finer adjustments to the values of the object. One of the things that can be really challenging and also fun about painting glass is capturing those really close value relationships. There are going to be areas on this object where the perimeter edge completely vanishes and is indistinguishable from the background. Taking advantage of these vanishing edges is a lot of fun. They add a lot of interest and mystery to a painting, and they also are a big clue to the transparent nature of the object that I'm painting. Eventually I reach a point where I'm more or less happy with the state of my jar, so I start blocking in more of the background. I like using a knife to do this because I'm a big fan of the kind of random marks that it makes. I take advantage of my knife to drag some of the background colors from the inside of the jar out into the background. This further blurs the edges. A knife can also be used to make very straight and incised edges. This is a great benefit when you're doing a mechanical object like a jar. Once I've got my background painted all the way out to the edges and I don't have any more white of my background showing through, I mix up some very, very pale yellow and add the highlights to the cap of the jar. There's also a very pale highlight moving down just inside the left edge of the jar. I mix up some cool light value and I use a knife to establish that. I then use my palette knife to establish the hot spot or main highlight on the right upper shoulder of the jar. It's looking pretty good, but I think the bottom of the jar needs just a little bit more definition. So I add just a couple of dark accents down there to establish that. And then I call it a day.